Hello everyone and welcome to the screencast on the Augustan Forum. This is designed as part of the Cambridge AS Level Classical Studies course, and this is part of the visual source material. The Augustan Forum is very important. It's going to bring together some of the politics, some of the literature, and above all the imperial image that Augustus wants to project of himself as part of his auctoritas or soft power agenda. Now, first of all, the function of the Forum of Augustus is very complex and multifaceted. It included ceremonies, Senate meetings, it's a place where magistrates made sacrifices, it's a place where victorious generals laid down their standards and banners, and where descendants of the great Roman families registered for their military roles. It also represented a political, military, and administrative center of the empire. So we need to see this as part of this extraordinary project of the renewal of Rome. Augustus, of course, boasts that he found Rome a city of brick and left it as a city of marble. So this is why it's such an important source for us as scholars of the Augustan Principate. We have to see that this is the absolute center that combines many of the administrative reforms, but also gives us a sense of this remarkable new city. We know that Sutonius tells us that Augustus he was then Octavian, was very impressed by Alexandria. We know that Mark Antony loved Alexandria and wanted to shift it to being the center, the capital of a new Rome, a new expansive Rome, whereas Augustus, on the other hand, wanted to create something like Alexandria within Rome. Now, what is really important is the fact that the Forum of Augustus, as we can see here, lies adjacent to the Forum of Caesar. Now we know that this is really important. It's part of the lineage that he is pushing all of the time. From his earliest days as Octavian, he styled himself as Diva Filius, as the son of the god, and really tried to work off Julius Caesar's kind of auctoritas as much as possible. Here, in a material and in an architectural form, we see that close alliance between them. Later emperors like Trajan will add to the forums, as we can see here. Now, I'm going to switch over to the literature, to Horace's Ode 1.12, as we can see here. Here he writes, "Great Julius's light shines like the radiant moon amid the lamps of night." Beautiful little piece of poetry there. Why is it so significant? It shows the close proximity between the two forums. It reiterates this remarkable relationship between them. We see here the contrast between the divine associations of the moon. And we know with any kind of illumination that Julius Caesar's divinity was announced by the fact that this was this extraordinary comet in the sky, and that Octavian at the time made the most of this, used this as a kind of propaganda stunt. Now here we have a plan of the Forum. We see here at the front the Temple of Mars Ultor. I don't need to remind you that this is a temple that Octavian commissioned as a token of his victory at Philippi, when he overcame the assassins, the murderers of his father Julius Caesar, and that he commissioned this temple to celebrate this extraordinary victory. We know in Res Gestae that he opens Res Gestae with the fact that he raises an army at 19 to avenge his father, and that this act is characterized as an act of pietas, or filial piety to his father, and it's central to his early mission. In Suetonius, the Temple of Mars, he writes, he had made a vow to build the Temple of Mars after the War of Philippi, which he took to avenge his father. Accordingly, he decreed that in the Senate should consider wars and claims for triumph, for it was those who were on their way to the provinces with military commands should be escorted. Okay, so here we see he's fulfilling the wishes of the gods. Something that Augustus loves is this idea that he's carrying out prophecy. And we see that very much in the Aeneid, don't we? Okay. This is very interesting, of course, because he claims that it's a place for triumphs, but we know that the final triumph in the on the tablet in the Forum of Augustus was Balbus, and thereafter there was no space for any other triumphs. And also we know that triumphs then were confined to the immediate members of the imperial family. The design behind that being, of course, that nobody else should have a large public profile that would make them a kind of credible alternative to the royal family. And very importantly, as I say here, it is framed as the organization of an increasingly large state. We need to see the Forum of Augustus as kind of Whitehall in London, or perhaps not so much the White House, I guess, but Washington itself, the kind of center of power and of state ceremony, etc. Now, moving on, a fantastic part of the Forum of Augustus is the Hall of Colossus. In it is the magnificent, huge statue of Augustus. We can see that he never ages. If we have a look at the Prima Porta, we can see that even though Augustus purports to be a great Roman patriot, his style of statuary is very Hellenic, and that it's much more of an idealized image of himself. You only have to look at statues of his father, Julius Caesar, to see him bald and wrinkled and very human looking. Augustus much prefers the Greek kind of sense of idealization of the human form. Why the statue is so interesting is it's a statue to the genius of Augustus. And it's worth pausing here to reflect on what this means in religious terms. Well, we know that Sutonius tells us in the East that Augustus had already become worshipped as a god, and that this was allowed to happen. Of course, in Rome, they didn't have these traditions of deifying people. You could kind of deify someone, as we saw from Julius Caesar, after they died, but they didn't like the idea of people being deified while they're alive. So what's very interesting, though, is there is a kind of nascent divine worship of Augustus, because later on in his reign, people began to pray to the genius of Augustus, which is a sort of sense of his soul or the immortal part of him. So we see that maybe Tacitus is right when he says that Augustus took the place of the gods, and that he was, increasingly developing this sense of, being a divine being. Suetonius, certainly at the end of his account of Augustus's life, goes into all the divine portents, etc. There's so many stories of these appearances of gods and thunderbolts, etc., that it does seem as though Maecenas and his other, propagandists were certainly putting around these stories in his lifetime, and we see this here in the statue of his genius. Moving on. The Cella of the temple, this has both the statues of Mars, the god of war, and Venus, the goddess of love. Venus, of course, is the mother of Aeneas, and this is very much supported in the Aeneid, that goes into a great deal of detail and establishes the close relationship between Venus, Aeneas, her son, and the Julian family. Mars was presented as the avenger of Julius Caesar's death, as we saw with the temple of Mars Ultor, and some of the sources claim that there was also a statue of the deified Julius Caesar in this particular temple. Moving on. This is the pediment of the temple. We see some very interesting figures here. Let's just pause on a couple of them. This is the god Mars. And of course, it's his temple, and this is built in the wake of Philippi. Here is Venus with her lovely connections to the Julii family, and this is Romulus. It's worth noting, of course, that Augustus, according to Suetonius, toyed with the idea of calling himself Romulus, but decided that there were too many negative connotations, and also, of course, Romulus had been a king, so he chooses the name Augustus instead. In the Aeneid, in the Pageant of the Heroes, which occurs in Book 6, when Aeneas goes to visit his father Anchises in the underworld, he is shown this extraordinary pageant of the heroes, this remarkable line of the great Romans. Now, of course, we know that this is a project of Augustus's, that he is absolutely determined that Romans see their extraordinary history, and of course, at the front of that queue of Roman heroes is, of course, himself. Now, the lines are, Mars' son will join the parade as his grandfather's comrade, Romulus. Venus is gleaming white as she presents Aeneas with offerings crafted with the skill by my husband. Now, this is a very, very important line. But first, the temple is a physical representation of the pageant of the heroes. And indeed, many of these heroes that are mentioned in Book 6 appear in the Forum of Augustus, giving the sense of a kind of lineage that goes from the gods to the demigods to the great heroes and to Augustus, who kind of mixes, who is a kind of demigod in many ways. The white here connotes purity. Many of the temples became white as the supply of marble increased. And I think, yes, this is definitely part of Augustus's moral crusade and the fact that he increasingly wants to be seen as a moral reformer. It's very important here to reference his Lex Julia here, his laws which included things like being tough on adultery, the need for marriage, and the celebration of childbirth. At the same time, of course, he's increasingly taking all of the different priesthoods, and in many statues we'll see, like in the Areopagus, etc., that he is often hooded as a symbol of his pietas. And here in this particular quotation, of course, this is when Aeneas is given this extraordinary armor by the god Vulcan, who is the husband of Venus, and the centerpiece of this armor is, of course, the shield of Aeneas, that has a kind of truncated Roman history, with the Battle of Actium being at the center of it. So it's important to see that there's a real coordination between the architecture and the literature. And at this point, I think it's worth sort of emphasizing that clearly somebody is shaping this. And this is where the figure of Maecenas comes in. He was a very close advisor and childhood friend of Octavian, later Augustus, and according to Sutonius, the rival of Agrippa. Agrippa was, of course, the tough, masculine military man, and Maecenas was the rather kind of effete member of the literati, who encouraged all these poets and historians and architects to get together. So we could say, while Agrippa sort of supplied the hard power, Maecenas supplied the soft power. Here we see the portico. I think what's important here is the heads of Jupiter Ammon, who Alexander the Great claimed to be a descendant. Now we know that Augustus was very fond of Alexander. When he went to Egypt following the death of Mark Antony, he visited the tomb of Alexander, and Suetonius tells us he in fact knocked off the mummy nose, which is rather unfortunate. He thereafter really in many ways modeled himself on Alexander in terms of many of the statues, particularly, just like Pompey the Great, he stole Alexander's fringe hairstyle. And I suppose, in a sense, that shows how he's moving towards a more Hellenic kind of divine being idea of power. Tacitus, as we know, who dislikes Augustus and the whole imperial line very much and laments it and looks back to the glory days of the Republic, maybe somewhat mythically we could say, tells us it was thus an altered world, and of the old unspoilt Roman character not a trace lingered. Why Tacitus is so important to us is, of course, he proves a kind of counter-argument to the idea that Augustus likes to put forward in Res Gestae, that he restored the Republic. Tacitus tells us, no, he didn't. He erased the Republic. And we can see that in much of this art, etc., which is kind of very glorious and not particularly Roman, if we're really honest. Now, the Hemon Cycles, these were used as tribunals. There's some very interesting statues here. We know from the Aeneid that they became much more interested in Rome in the kind of prehistory of Rome, in particular of Alba Longa, and then further back to the destruction of Troy and the extraordinary kind of odyssey of Aeneas as he finds his way to Latium. And the kings of Alba Longa are the ancestors. So this is part of this extraordinary interest in history that we find in the Augustan age. We know that Augustus, when he returned from Egypt from destroying Mark Antony and taking Egypt as his personal possession, that he had many of the Sibylline scripts rounded up, many of them burned, and he was able to sort of rewrite history, making his family the absolute center of it. Now, when we look at this, we see that they're members of the Julian family and Aeneas and Romulus. And all of these are apparently his ancestors. Now, that's very interesting because in his lifetime, in the 30s BC, Mark Antony would laugh at him, and it was part of Mark Antony's propaganda campaign to point out that Augustus's father had been a baker. So even though Mark Antony was a plebeian, he was a kind of aristocratic, a patrician plebeian, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, but it wasn't. He was from a very powerful family. Mark Antony would sneer at his lineage. Well, Augustus, in terms of the Augustan Forum, has the most glorious image. So he's completely rewritten his humble origins, and now his origins are kind of divine and indeed semi-divine. Now, the Temple of Apollo is a very important part of the Palatine Hill. And if we look at this date, it's very important. It's built in return for a victory at the Battle of Knolicus and the Battle of Actium. I'm going to pause here on the Battle of Knolicus, 36 BC, and just remind you what an important date that was. Up until this point, really, Octavian had been suffering in Rome with famines and the naval blockade from Sextus Pompey and from the proscriptions and having to deal with the returning veterans who really had no land. And it was a terrible time for him. And meanwhile, Antony had been having his lavish parties in the east. But in 36 BC, Antony fails in Parthia, loses Roman standards, and never really recovers from that moment. In contrast, Octavian, through his general Agrippa, defeats Sextus Pompey, then goes on to have his own personal military victories in Illyricum, and really things in Rome start to get much better. And from then on, really, Octavian and later Augustus is on the winning side. Now, Apollo becomes his great god. We know at the Festival of the Gods that he dressed as Apollo while Rome was starving, and that was a terrible mistake. But now he starts to use the image of Apollo very cleverly. Many historians talk about the battle between Mark Antony and Octavian as the battle between Apollo and Dionysus, and that's because Antony has increasingly been taking on Eastern habits, dressing as a Greek, allowing himself to be worshipped, indulging in great luxuries, etc., that the Romans disapproved of, and really associating himself with the whole cult of Dionysus. In contrast, Apollo is the god of harmony and music, reason and light. And that's how Octavian is going to characterize himself. So having this great, beautiful white temple to Apollo is part of the Augustan branding and the rejection of this kind of Antonian Eastern luxury and wildness. Now, the Thunderbolt is a very interesting part because it was built on land Augustus had intended for his residence. And we know that Augustus is very fond of all of these portents, etc. We spoke earlier a little bit about the comet, and we mentioned that Sutonius is always talking about all of these messages from the gods to show that Augustus is going to be a remarkable person. Here again is an opportunity for Augustus to show his pietas, the fact that he defers to the gods. And this ground then is consecrated to Apollo. And that, I think, is really interesting and another wonderful kind of divine myth that Augustus and his propagandists will spread. Now we see here, this is the Domus of Augusta here, this is Augustus's house here, this is the Villa Mill, and if we go up here we can see on the Palatine Hill this would be the Temple of Apollo, so it would be shining white on the hill here, and this whole Palatine Hill becomes absolutely remarkable area with Livia's house and various other extraordinary buildings. It's interesting, of course, that Augustus's house, we're told by Sutonius, is meager in comparison to some of these other buildings. In the Carmen Seculare, there is an allusion to the Temple of Apollo. We're told that Apollo will be worshipped forever. Gentle and peaceful Apollo, lay down your arms. Now that sounds very like the Augustan peace and Augustus's boast in Res Gestae that the gates of Janus were shut 3 times in his lifetime, and that is symbolic of the fact that he so often brings not war but peace. Another beautiful line is, he favors the Palatine altars, extend Rome's power. So we have Apollo perched on the hill, directing this expansion of the Roman Empire. So really, and we get this very much in the Aeneid in Book 8, that the gods are on the side of Roman expansion. We know that hymns were sung on the Palatine and the Capitoline Hills, focusing on revering Apollo and Diana, and that this Carmen Seculare, as I said earlier, is part of the secular games, this extraordinary pageant. You can imagine these 99 boy virgin and girl virgins singing with incense everywhere and sacrifices, and what it was a kind of almost millennial-like idea of religious devotion, etc., as well as the games themselves. Now, in the Aeneid, we're told Phoebus's snowy white sanctum, thanking his people for gifts now attached with pride at portals. What's so important there is the snowy white sanctum. Sounds like a reference to the Augustan mausoleum, which was on the Campus Martius. We know that it was the tallest building in Rome, and in fact subsequent emperors didn't build taller than it also. It was this shining white extraordinary mausoleum with a bronze statue on top of Augustus that absolutely dominated the skyline. So what do we have here? We have the merging of a kind of divine mythical world together with the concrete world that Romans lived in their everyday lives. And once again with Suetonius, if we link to the aftermath of the Battle of Actium, we're told to extend the fame of his victory at Actium and perpetuate his memory, he enlarged the ancient temple of Apollo. Notice that, the ancient. Now, why have I underlined that? Well, that's because this is part of the whole project, the whole narrative, that Augustus is not an innovator, not a changer. He's a restorer. And that is what he tells us in Res Gestae. In fact, he tells us that he restores so many temples and he restores religious festivals. We saw that with the secular games. And he lists many of these temples. And so this is really important that once again the Temple of Apollo is not a new creation, it is a kind of improvement on the old. The whole project of making Rome great again. So the Aeneid also says that Apollo is Actium's god. Actium is at the center of Aeneas's shield. On the other hand, Anthony Everett tells us that Actium was a scrappy breakout, so it wasn't an important battle. But in the rewriting of Roman history, which occurs in the Aeneid, we have the fact that Actium is the centerpiece, the kind of zenith of military glory in Rome. Now, Suetonius tells us when he's talking about Augustus the man that he disliked large and sumptuous country palaces, in fact razing to the ground one which his granddaughter Julia built. Now, I just want to remind you that Julia was a very naughty person who did all sorts of bad things, and in light of the fact that Augustus had passed his Lex Julia, his moral laws, he had her exiled, and I think it's really interesting that she, as this kind of bad, wild girl, is identified as someone who lives in this lavish palace. By contrast, of course, Augustus leads a humble life, with his wife spinning his homemade clothes and him eating a few grapes and olives and glasses of water and writing letters to Tiberius about how he fasts more than any Jew accordingly. And he uses that example because the Jews were famous for fasting and for being pious. So why do I mention this? Well, it's kind of interesting that we have all this lavish innovation, this architectural splendor, but the man himself likes to have this profile of being kind of folksy, or at least ascetic, and leading a relatively Spartan life. Now, I think that helps to camouflage his power and perhaps to disguise the fact that we have a kind of nascent monarchy. Now, furthermore, Augustus the man, Suetonius tells us his reason for building the forum was to increase the number of the people and of cases of law. Now, it is true, and we're told in Res Gestae that he grows the population by nearly 1 million. He tells us that he's had this lustrum, these censuses, which he's conducted in his capacity as censor. And it is worth saying that many of the architectural innovations at the time had a kind of philosophy of form follows function. So this space was very useful, and it did actually accomplish things. And I'd like to say that it was the center of kind of Roman administration in a way. And if we think to ourselves that Agrippa, aside from being a brilliant military man, was also a superb administrator, built extraordinary new roads across Rome, improved transportation links, built aqueducts that brought fresh water, which must have absolutely revolutionized people's lives, as well as more food from the countryside with better travel, more sanitation, better dwellings. All of these things show that there was this kind of extraordinary improvement in terms of infrastructure and administration. And at the heart of this is the Forum of Augustus. So to conclude, the Forum of Augustus and the Forum of Caesar were adjacent to one another, and later emperors would add more parts to them. We know that the Temple of Mars Ultor was at the front of the Forum of Augustus, and we know that goes back to the history of the promise following the Battle of Philippi. We saw the hall of the Colossus, and we looked at the fact that it had the statue to the genius of Augustus, and I said I felt that was very important in terms of linking it to this kind of growing divine cult that existed around Augustus. We saw the pediment of the temple and the fact that he's very desperate to include in his ancestry Romulus, Mars, Venus, and that these are the kind of people that make him a kind of semi-divine person, of course a divine person later. We saw that in the porticos we had the links to Alexander the Great, and of course, really perhaps most importantly, the Temple of Apollo, the beautiful Temple of Apollo. Really, I like to link to the fact that it was so central to the curation of Augustus's image as this kind of shining light of reason and harmony, and bringing plenty, fecundity, and what Portico calls this kind of golden age of arts and agriculture to Rome after a century of infighting as the Republic disintegrated. Ultimately, the Forum shows the kind of coalescence between the literature and then the architectural physical reality in which Romans lived. And it was part of this brilliant campaign to make Augustus Caesar the center of all things in Rome. Now, it's worth just pausing to say many of these statues, like the Prima Porta, etc., were exported right around the empire into the provinces. But within Rome, the Forum of Augustus served as the center of his imperial power and his imperial image. Thanks for listening.